Phenomenological investigation of rape. Victims of rape tend to internalize the view of themselves as projected by the rapist. Their normal reality is deconstructed, derealized, and delegitimized and converted into a shrunken, unreal, paper-thin world presided over completely by the will and power of the rapist. The horizon of this new shrunken world is the victim's physical pain, fear of death, and the actual reduction to the less than human, or in Hegel's terms, dependent consciousness. Her whole world, previously experienced as interconnected safe spaces full of potential for living, within which she could expand and project herself intentionally as a subject, has shrunk and had become reduced to her body, lived as thing, object, inanimate, finite, mortal, and the cause of, or at the very least accomplice in, her pain and humiliation. For the duration of the rape, the body with its pain and humiliation, and the body as thing causing that suffering, becomes the victim's only experience of herself. She experiences her soul or spirit as annihilated and split off. She experiences the murder of herself as a subject with an own will, an own desire, and an own truth and world. With trauma-enhanced clarity, a new, despicable, treacherous version of herself is burned into her consciousness, and because she instinctively wants to live, she to some extent, on the pain of death, allows this to happen. Moreover, the accusations of self-betrayal, self-effacement, and complicity falls, in a sense, in fertile ground. I have said before that rape not only destroys female subjectivity, but it also denies its prior existence, denied that it had ever existed or will exist in future. The experience of being rapeable and being raped severely undermines a woman's sense of her own subject status, her being for herself. The traumatic and violent disruption of her prior sense of being for herself is caused partly by the rapist's treatment of her as subhuman, partly because of her own complicity in and implicit agreement with this, but also, importantly, partly by the wider society's treatment of the rape victim as a blameworthy or complicit. Rape's erasure of female sexual subjectivity is thus firmly rooted in a wider social and symbolic context which also treats it with suspicion and systematically renders it problematic. It only works so well and instills so much terror in women because the soil is well prepared for it in the everyday lived experience of the woman subject. In a very real sense, then, the unmaking of the self, its deconstruction into a living corpse, which happens in rape, feeds on the victim's prior knowledge and recognition, remembrance of herself as subhuman and instrumental, a prior knowledge contained within the dominant symbolic order. The fear of being raped and the experience of being raped thus both leave women feeling particularly vulnerable within the social order. Women's knowledge of their rapeability translates into a fragility in their sense of self, which is not the same as the fragile self of postmodern philosophy. The experience of rape and of rapeability threatens to destroy a woman's sense of self, of being for self, in the world, and thus impacts greatly on her relation with all her others. Rape destroys one's sense of others in relation to self and world. According to my phenomenological model, one's lived world, self, and others constitute and shape each other mutually and also continuously. The previous subsection was devoted to showing how damage to the self in rape translates into subject-destroying spirit injury in relation to one's world, and the shame of complicity in relation to others. In this subsection, the focus is on the way in which the experience of being raped damages one's relation with others, translating into loss of voice in relation to the self, and loss of moral rage as a feature of one's being in the world. First, however, it is important to show to what extent it is the structural relation between the victim and rapist, self and other, that makes rape what it is. I have explained that rapist and victim share some aspects of reality in the situation of rape, but that other aspects of it split up into two separate and antagonistic realities. This renders the situation inherently fragile and unstable. At least two factors contribute greatly to this instability. A. The fact that the rapist, Lord, chooses to deal only with some aspects of reality, leaving the victim, bondsman, to deal with the other aspects. And B. The fact that the victim's, bondsman's, consciousness is itself made to carry this split reality as a contradiction and a tension, a feat which can only be sustained as long as fear sufficiently represses the victim's, bondsman's, knowledge about the possibility of her, his, own being for self, that she, he, stays complicit in her, his, own demise. As in Hegel and in Scarry, I contend that also the rape situation cannot be understood without regarding the relation between rapist and victim as key. The relation is, of course, often misconstrued, as I have indicated, along the lines of a property crime, which in turn supports the superficial interpretation that what the rapist really wants and takes from the victim is sexual pleasure. However, my reading so far has suggested that the situation is more complex. In particular, I am suggesting that what the rapist is after is clearly not normal or simple sexual pleasures, nor reciprocity, but much rather an affirmation of his sense of self. John Stoltenberg's study of rape yielded a similar understanding. He sees the performed and experienced disintegration of the rape victim's sense of self as a prerequisite for the integration and affirmation of the rapist's sense of self, and Elaine Scarry's point about the ontological relation between the torturer and the tortured can similarly be applied to that between rapist and victim. Their relation is like the unfurling of world maps, or a dramatically unequal contest for ontological domination. By forcing her implied acknowledgement that she is inferior femininity because he is superior masculinity, both his sense of self and of his place in the world are affirmed, extended, and expanded. Little wonder that most rapists report experiencing a sense of exhilaration and life affirmation after the event. Also, Nicholas Grass states that the offender, rapist, derives pleasure from both controlling his victim and hurting her, an intense sense of excitement and pleasure being experienced in this context, whether or not actual sexual contact is made. In rape, the victim is thus forced to share in and affirm the world and truth of the rapist, and that world or truth is created quite explicitly and deliberately in opposition to the world and truth of the victim, crushing the latter. It is the threatening otherness of the victim that needs to be destroyed through a process of violence which leads the victim to deny the validity of her own experience, truth, and world, and to thereby affirm the opposing self, truth, and world of the aggressor. In other words, the rapist makes up and makes real a world in which the victim plays an indispensable part. She has to validate that world by attesting to her inessential consciousness, a testimony which affirms his consciousness as essential and his being for self as truth. Killing someone's spirit and self in this way is in a sense worse than killing them physically, because the spirit injury is characterized by a living being's loss of self and agency, evoking the image of the living dead. My vocabulary has started to suggest that rape is a kind of performance or theater, an idea also drawn from Scary's work, in which the rapist's world and self are made up and then made real, expanding and enlarging on the one hand, and deconstructing on the other the world of the victim in the process. Or rather, it is precisely the performed deconstruction of the victim's world which affirms for the rapist his world. This process happens through the actual material markers the rapist forces out of the victim, such as cries and tears, visible and audible pain, fear, and humiliation. The material markers of the victim's subhumanity or inferiority affirm for the rapist his existence as absolute and his world as powerful. This means that some of pain's attributes, its incontestable reality, its totality, its ability to eclipse all else, its power or dramatic alteration and world dissolution, can be lifted away from their source, can be separated from the sufferer and referred to power, broken from the body and attached instead to the regime. In the case of rape, it is the material markers of the victim's pain and sexual humiliation that are broken from her body and translated into the effects and the indubitability of phallic power. Clearly, for such a spectacle to be needed, the regime to be affirmed must be highly contested in the first place. My understanding of rape suggests that rape serves to affirm the rapist's masculine sense of self and his sense of having a place in the world through a sharp and violent demarcation of his identity from the feminine. Rape is thus always about territory, symbolic, political, physical territory, and its logic dictates that the struggle plays itself out in terms of the dehumanization of the female sex and the feminine symbolic. Rape is first and foremost a violent assertion of the legitimacy of the masculine universal, and therefore always in the first place a pushing back of woman, especially her independent therefore threatening and contestatory aspects. Onto the margins of the political, whether the territorial struggle is primarily one between the sexes or not. By this I mean that purely masculine territorial struggles often also play themselves out in terms of the systematic rape of each other's women. The reduction of the woman's body to mere flesh and sheer availability is needed and thus constructed or performed in rape as a foil over against which masculine sexual subjectivity, as the superior opposite of female sexuality, may be established as real. Thus, the less real her sexual subjectivity, the more real his sexual subjectivity becomes. Stoltenberg describes the rapist logic as follows. You really are a man. That slavish and submissive creature there, spreading her legs, is really not. You and that creature have nothing in common. That creature is an alien, inanimate thing, but your penis is completely real and alive. Now you can come. Thank God Almighty, you have a sex at last. In rape, masculine sexual identity as difference from and power over the feminine and female sexuality is what must be affirmed. Therefore, the victim's fear is the only aspect of her subjectivity which the rapist not only allows to be expressed, but needs to hear and see expressed. Her fear seems to play a vital role in feeding the sexual ego of the rapist. Rain describes the rapist as a kind of parasite. I understood that this entity, his rage, was hunger, and that it was feasting on something from me, my terror, my physical and psychic pain. It got energy from me, and in the initial moments of the attack, when my terror was uncontrollable, it had gained strength. I sensed that the rapist wanted me to beg and plead, humiliate myself so he could feed this furious entity that was tormenting him in its hunger. His cat and mouse game and his destruction of my possessions were attempts to recreate the energy exchange of the initial attack.